The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the small human colony of Epsilon 7. It was a quiet place, or at least it had been before the invasion began. The colony was nestled between jagged cliffs and rolling plains, its buildings made of prefabricated metal and concrete, designed to withstand the harsh winds that swept across the planet. For years, life here had been peaceful, even mundane. Farmers tended crops engineered to grow in alien soil, engineers maintained the power grid, and families went about their daily routines without much thought for danger beyond occasional equipment, malfunctions, or supply shortages. But now everything had changed. The attack came suddenly, without warning. One moment, the colony buzzed with activity as workers prepared for another day. The next, alarms blared, piercing the air like a scream. From above, shadows darkened the sky, countless ships descending like locusts, blotting out the light of the twin suns. Panic spread through the streets as people scrambled for shelter, but there was nowhere safe to hide. The invaders struck, hard and fast, their weapons tearing through walls and defenses with horrifying ease. Daniel Carter ran through the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a soldier, he never wanted to be one. But when the first wave hit, he grabbed whatever weapon he could find and joined the fight. His hands trembled as he held the rifle, its weight unfamiliar and unwelcome. Behind him, his younger sister Laura followed closely, her face pale but determined. She had always been the stronger of the two, both physically and emotionally, but even she looked shaken by what was happening around them. "Stay close," Daniel shouted over the deafening roar of explosions and gunfire. His voice cracked under the strain, but Laura nodded, clutching a makeshift spear they'd fashioned from scrap metal earlier that morning. They ducked behind a crumbling wall just as a burst of energy seared past them, leaving scorch marks on the ground where they had stood moments before. The attackers were unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. They moved with unnatural speed, their insectoid bodies glinting menacingly in the dim light. Their limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity. Every movement seemed calculated, every strike precise. They didn't speak, not in any language Daniel understood, but their intentions were clear: destroy everything in their path. The colonists fought back with whatever tools they had at their disposal. Some wielded rifles scavenged from old supply crates, while others used farming equipment, repurposed into crude weapons. A few brave souls manned the colony's turrets, firing bursts of plasma at the advancing horde. But no matter how many of the creatures fell, more surged forward, relentless and unyielding. Laura broke away from Daniel briefly, climbing onto a nearby platform to get a better vantage point. Her fingers tightened around the spear as she scanned the battlefield. "There are too many of them," she yelled down to him, her voice tinged with desperation. "We can't hold them off forever." "I know," Daniel replied grimly. He didn't need her to tell him that. The truth was written all over the faces of the people around him. The exhaustion, the fear, the growing realization that this might be the end. The outer walls of the colony had already collapsed, and the inner defenses wouldn't last much longer. Each passing second brought the enemy closer to breaching their final line of resistance. As if sensing his thoughts, a massive explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet. Daniel stumbled, nearly losing his grip on the rifle. When he regained his footing, he saw smoke rising from the direction of the main gate. The barricade they had spent hours reinforcing was gone, reduced to rubble in an instant. Through the haze, he caught glimpses of the enemy pouring in, their numbers overwhelming. "We have to fall back," someone shouted nearby. Daniel turned to see Mrs. Harper, a middle-aged woman who usually ran the colony's schoolhouse, waving frantically at a group of survivors. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her voice carried authority. "To the command center, everyone to the command center." Daniel hesitated, torn between following orders and staying to help cover the retreat. Before he could decide, Laura grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the crowd of retreating colonists. "Come on," she urged, her tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Daniel obeyed, keeping his rifle trained on the advancing swarm. As they backed away slowly, the journey to the command center felt like an eternity. Every step was fraught with peril, every corner a potential ambush. Along the way, they passed the wounded and the dead, people they had known, people they had laughed and shared meals with. Daniel forced himself not to look too closely, focusing, instead, on putting one foot in front of the other. If he let his emotions take over, he knew he wouldn't be able to keep moving. When they finally reached the command center, the scene inside was chaotic. Survivors packed the small room, some tending to injuries, others trying to repair damaged communication systems. At the center of it all stood Mr. Peterson, the colony's leader, barking orders into a handheld radio. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice remained steady. "This is Colony Leader Peterson of Epsilon 7, he repeated over and over again. "We are under heavy attack and require immediate assistance. Repeat, we require immediate assistance." No response came. Only static greeted his pleas, mocking the futility of their situation. Daniel exchanged a glance with Laura. Neither of them needed to say anything. They both knew what it meant. They were alone. Just as despair began to settle over the room like a suffocating blanket, something extraordinary happened. Outside, the sound of distant engines grew louder, drowning out the noise of battle. At first, Daniel thought it was another wave of attackers, but then he noticed something different about the hum. It was deeper, more resonant, almost musical. Curiosity overtook fear, and he rushed to a nearby window, peering out cautiously. What he saw took his breath away. Dozens of sleek, angular ships descended from the sky, their hulls gleaming with polished steel and glass. They moved with precision, forming a protective perimeter around the colony. Dropships detached from the larger vessels, hovering momentarily before touching down gently on the ground. From within, figures emerged. Human figures clad in advanced exosuits that enhanced their strength and agility. They carried weapons unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, glowing with energy and bristling with technology. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The colonists stared in awe, unsure whether to believe their eyes. Were these reinforcements real? Or was this some cruel trick played by the invaders? The answer came quickly. The newcomers wasted no time launching an immediate counterattack. Their weapons roared to life, unleashing torrents of fire that cut through the enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat. The insectoid creatures screeched in agony as they were mowed down. Their advance halted for the first time since the invasion began. Cheers erupted from the colonists, mingling with cries of relief and disbelief. Among the soldiers leading the charge was a man whose presence commanded attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore the insignia of a captain on his armor. His name was Ryan Mitchell, though none of the colonists knew that yet. All they saw was a figure of authority and strength, someone who radiated confidence even in the face of overwhelming odds. Beside him stood a woman with sharp features and keen eyes directing troops with calm efficiency. Her name was Samantha Brooks, and she was already formulating strategies to turn the tide of the battle. As the soldiers pushed forward, driving the invaders back, Daniel felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. For the first time since the attack began, he allowed himself to believe that survival might still be possible. But even as the tide shifted in their favor, questions lingered in the back of his mind. Who were these soldiers? Where had they come from? And most importantly, why had they chosen to intervene now, when all seemed lost? Whatever the answers, one thing was certain. The arrival of these warriors had changed everything. The colonists of Epsilon 7 were no longer fighting alone. The arrival of the soldiers was like a miracle, but miracles often come with questions. As the battle raged outside, Daniel and Laura stood frozen in the command center, staring out the window at the scene unfolding before them. The newcomers moved with precision, their every action deliberate and calculated. Their weapons glowed with an eerie blue light, each shot tearing through the insectoid invaders with devastating efficiency. The colonists watched in stunned silence as the tide of the battle began to shift. For the first time since the invasion started, there was hope. Captain Ryan Mitchell led the charge, his voice booming over the comm system embedded in his helmet. "Squad Alpha, flank left, Beta, secure the perimeter." His commands were clear and confident, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Beside him, Lieutenant Samantha Brooks coordinated the operation with calm authority, her eyes scanning the battlefield for weaknesses in the enemy's formation. Together they worked seamlessly, their teamwork evident even to those unfamiliar with military tactics. For the colonists, it was hard to process what was happening. Just moments ago, they had been on the brink of annihilation, their defenses crumbling under the relentless assault of the Zorathians. Now these armored figures descended from the sky like avenging angels, turning the tide of the fight almost instantly. Cheers erupted from some of the survivors while others simply collapsed in relief, their bodies too exhausted to do anything but cry. Daniel felt tears welling up in his own eyes, but he blinked them away quickly. There was no time for emotion, yet, not when the battle was still raging. Outside, the soldiers advanced steadily, pushing the Zorathians back toward the outskirts of the colony. Their exosuits gave them incredible strength and speed, allowing them to dodge attacks that would have been fatal to ordinary humans. Some of the soldiers wielded handheld plasma rifles, their shots precise and deadly, while others carried larger weapons mounted on their shoulders, capable of obliterating entire groups of enemies with a single blast. The air crackled with energy as explosions lit up the horizon, sending shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. Despite their impressive display of power, the soldiers didn't act recklessly. Every movement was strategic, every decision carefully considered. Lieutenant Brooks remained in constant communication with her troops, adjusting their positions based on the evolving situation. She noticed that the Zorathians tended to cluster together in large groups, making them vulnerable to area of effect attacks. With a few quick orders, she directed one of her squads to deploy a series of explosive drones, which hovered silently, into position before detonating with devastating force. The tactic worked perfectly, scattering the enemy and giving the soldiers an opening to press their advantage. Inside the command center, the colonists tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. Mr. Peterson, the colony leader, approached the window cautiously, his hands trembling as he leaned against the frame for support. "Who are they?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. No one answered. They were all too busy watching the soldiers work. Laura tugged on Daniel's sleeve, pulling him away from the crowd. "Do you think they're from Earth?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the noise outside. Daniel shrugged, unsure how to respond. It seemed likely. Their gear bore markings similar to those used by Earth's military forces. But why would Earth send reinforcements to such a remote colony? Epsilon 7 wasn't particularly important or strategically valuable. It was just a small outpost on the edge of human-controlled space, populated mostly by farmers and miners. Why go to such lengths to save them? Before Daniel could formulate an answer, the door to the command center burst open and two soldiers entered. One of them was Captain Mitchell, his armor scuffed but otherwise intact. The other was a younger man, his face flushed with exertion beneath his helmet. Both carried themselves with an air of authority, though Mitchell's presence was especially commanding. He scanned the room quickly, taking stock of the survivors before stepping forward. "Everyone all right in here?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. The question hung in the air for a moment, met with stunned silence. Finally, Mr. Peterson stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. We're holding on," he stammered, "but we've lost a lot of people." Mitchell nodded grimly, his expression unreadable behind the visor of his helmet. "I'm sorry for your losses," he said. "We'll do everything we can to stop this attack and protect what's left of your colony." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The colonists exchanged glances, some nodding in gratitude, others still too overwhelmed to react. Lieutenant Brooks joined them shortly after, entering with the same brisk efficiency as Mitchell. She carried a portable scanner in one hand, its screen glowing faintly as she reviewed data about the colony's layout and resources. "How many survivors are there?" she asked, addressing Mr. Peterson directly. Her tone was polite but businesslike, leaving no room for hesitation. About 50, Mr. Peterson replied. Maybe a few more. We haven't done a full count yet. Brooks nodded, jotting down notes on a digital tablet strapped to her wrist. Good. We'll need everyone accounted for once the immediate threat is neutralized. For now, stay inside and let us handle things. These walls won't hold forever, but they'll buy us enough time to regroup. Her words reassured the colonists, though Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than she was letting on. Something about the way she spoke, calm, measured, almost detached, made him uneasy. It wasn't that. She seemed uncaring. Rather, it was the opposite. She appeared so focused, so determined that it bordered on unsettling. What exactly were these soldiers prepared to do to win this fight? As if sensing his unease, Laura nudged him gently. They're here to help, she whispered. That's all that matters right now. Daniel nodded, forcing a smile he didn't quite feel. She was right, of course. Whatever doubts he might have had, the soldiers' arrival had saved their lives. That much was undeniable. Outside, the battle continued to rage, but the momentum had clearly shifted. The Zorathians were retreating, their numbers dwindling under the relentless assault of the soldiers. Bodies littered the ground, both alien and human, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. But despite the destruction, there was a sense of order returning to the chaos. The soldiers moved methodically, securing key areas of the colony and setting up temporary barricades to prevent further incursions. One of the soldiers, a young woman with short brown hair, approached the command center carrying a large crate filled with medical supplies. She introduced herself as Sergeant Emily Dawson, her voice warm and reassuring. Take whatever you need, she told the colonists, gesturing to the contents of the crate. We brought extra rations and water, too. They're being distributed outside. The gesture was appreciated, though few of the colonists had the energy to move. Most simply sat where they were, staring blankly at the floor or leaning against the walls for support. Exhaustion had set in, both physical and emotional, and the adrenaline that had kept them going during the initial attack was beginning to wear off. Daniel slid down onto the floor next to Laura, resting his head against the cool metal wall. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to relax, however briefly. As the minutes passed, the sound of gunfire grew quieter, replaced by the hum of machinery and the occasional shout from the soldiers coordinating their efforts. Inside the command center, conversations began to pick up again, tentative at first but gradually growing louder as the survivors processed what had happened. Questions flew back and forth. Who were these soldiers? Where had they come from? And most importantly, why had they intervened? Mr. Peterson tried to answer as best he could, though much of the information came second-hand from Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Brooks. According to them, the soldiers belonged to a special operations unit tasked with responding to emergencies on human colonies. They had received a distress signal from Epsilon 7, a faint transmission that barely made it through before communications were cut off, and raced to the scene as quickly as possible. It was pure luck, really, that they arrived when they did. Any later and the colony might have been completely overrun. The explanation satisfied some of the colonists, but others remained skeptical, Daniel included. He couldn't help but wonder why Earth would invest so heavily in defending such a minor outpost. Surely there were more important colonies requiring protection. And what about the Zorathians? How had they found Epsilon 7 in the first place? None of it added up. Still, he knew better than to dwell on those thoughts for too long. For now, the priority was survival. The soldiers had bought them a reprieve, but the battle wasn't over yet. The Zorathians might be retreating, but they wouldn't give up easily. This was only the beginning. As night fell, the soldiers established a defensive perimeter around the colony, their lights casting long shadows across the landscape. Inside the command center, the colonists huddled together, sharing stories and trying to make sense of the day's events. Despite the uncertainty, there was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a shared understanding that they had survived something unimaginable. And for the first time in hours, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe just the night settled over Epsilon 7, bringing with it a cold silence that felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the day. The soldiers worked tirelessly to fortify the colony's defenses, their movements illuminated by the soft glow of portable floodlights. Outside, the air was thick with tension, as if everyone expected another attack at any moment. Inside the command center, however, the atmosphere had shifted slightly. The colonists were still shaken, but the presence of the soldiers had brought a fragile sense of security. For now, they could breathe, even if only for a little while. Daniel and Laura sat together near the back of the room, wrapped in blankets, provided by Sergeant Dawson. Neither of them had spoken much since the fighting died down, too exhausted to form coherent thoughts. Around them, other survivors whispered quietly, sharing fragments of their experiences or simply sitting in silence. Some clung to loved ones, grateful to still have each other, while others stared blankly at the floor, their minds replaying the horrors they had witnessed. A short distance away, Captain Mitchell stood talking with Lieutenant Brooks and Mr. Peterson. The three of them huddled over a holographic map projected onto a small table, its blue light casting eerie shadows on their faces. Mitchell pointed to various locations on the map, his voice low but firm as he outlined plans for reinforcing the colony's perimeter. Brooks listened intently, occasionally interjecting with suggestions or corrections. Mr. Peterson nodded along, though it was clear he didn't fully understand everything they were discussing. Still, he seemed relieved to have someone else take charge. Laura leaned closer to Daniel, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think we should say something? To thank them, I mean." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the group. He wasn't sure how to approach them. They seemed so focused, so professional. It felt strange to interrupt, especially when they were clearly busy planning the next steps. But Laura was right. These soldiers had saved their lives, and showing gratitude seemed like the least they could do. Before he could respond, one of the soldiers approached them, a young man named Jake Harper. His helmet was tucked under his arm, revealing a boyish face marked with dirt and sweat. Despite his disheveled appearance, he smiled warmly as he knelt beside them. "Hey there," he said, his tone friendly and casual. "You two holding up okay?" Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. Yeah," he stammered. "I guess so." Jake chuckled softly. "That's good to hear. You guys did great out there today. Not many people would have lasted, as long as you did against those things." Laura frowned, shaking her head. "We didn't do much. Just tried to stay alive." "That's more than most can say," Jake replied, his smile unwavering. "Trust me, I've seen plenty of colonies go down without putting up much of a fight. What you did, it matters." His words hung in the air, simple yet profound. Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat, unsure how to respond. He hadn't thought of their actions as brave. Survival had been instinctual, driven by fear rather than courage. Hearing someone call it otherwise made him uncomfortable, though not entirely in a bad way. Jake must have noticed the hesitation because he quickly changed the subject. "So, what's your story? How'd you end up here on Epsilon 7? It was Laura who answered first, her voice steadier this time. "Our parents came here years ago," she explained. "They wanted to start fresh, away from Earth. We grew up farming mostly. Never thought we'd end up fighting aliens." Jake laughed, the sound genuine and infectious. "Well, life's funny like that. One day you're planting crops, the next you're dodging plasma bolts. Happens to the best of us." Despite herself, Laura cracked a small smile. Even Daniel found himself chuckling weakly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. There was something about Jake's demeanor that put people at ease. His easygoing nature, his willingness to connect even in the middle of a crisis. It reminded Daniel of home, of simpler times before the invasion. As they talked, other soldiers began mingling with the colonists, offering water, food, and reassurance. Many of them shared stories of their own battles, their voices tinged with both pride and sorrow. Some spoke of victories won against impossible odds, while others recounted losses that still haunted them. Through it all, there was a shared understanding, a bond forged by the harsh realities of war. Sergeant Emily Dawson joined the conversation after a while, pulling up a chair and introducing herself properly. Unlike Jake, whose warmth bordered on playful, Dawson carried an air of quiet strength. She listened more than she spoke, her sharp eyes observing everything around her. When she finally did speak, her words carried weight. "You know," she said, addressing Daniel and Laura, "you two remind me of my brother and sister. Same age, same stubborn streak." She smirked faintly, though there was a hint of sadness behind her expression. "They're back on Earth, safe for now. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like if they were here instead of me." Laura tilted her head, curious. "Do you miss them?" "Every day," Dawson admitted without hesitation. "But being out here doing this work, it gives me purpose. Knowing I'm protecting people like them makes it worth it." Her honesty struck a chord with Daniel. He had always thought of soldiers as distant figures, almost mythical in their bravery and resolve. Seeing them as real people, with families and fears of their own, made them seem more human somehow, more relatable. As the evening wore on, the conversations continued, weaving threads of connection between the colonists and their rescuers. For the first time since the invasion began, the atmosphere in the command center felt less like a refuge and more like a community. People laughed, cried, and shared memories, finding solace in each other's company. Even Mr. Peterson joined, eventually recounting tales of his early days on Epsilon 7 and the challenges of building the colony from scratch. Captain Mitchell watched it all unfold from a distance, his arms crossed as he leaned against the wall. Though he didn't join in the discussions, there was a faint smile on his face, a rare glimpse of warmth beneath his stoic exterior. Beside him, Lieutenant Brooks observed the scene with a similar expression, though her focus remained sharp. She knew the reprieve wouldn't last long. The Zorathians would regroup and return, stronger and angrier than before. But for now, she allowed herself to appreciate the moment. Eventually, Jake excused himself, explaining that he needed to check on the perimeter. Before leaving, he gave Daniel and Laura a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Hang in there, all right? We've got your backs." As he walked away, Laura turned to Daniel, her eyes shining with determination. "We need to help them," she said firmly. "Not just sit here waiting for the next attack. We know this place better than anyone. We can make a difference." Daniel hesitated, torn between fear and responsibility. He wanted to argue, to tell her that they had done enough already, but deep down he knew she was right. The soldiers couldn't win this fight alone, not without local knowledge and support. If they truly wanted to protect their home, they would have to step up. "I'll talk to Captain Mitchell," he said finally, his voice steadier than he expected. "See if there's anything we can do." Laura nodded, satisfied. Together they approached Mitchell, who greeted them with a raised eyebrow. "What is it?" he asked, his tone neutral, but not unkind. "We want to help," Daniel said, meeting the captain's gaze despite the intimidation factor. "We know the terrain, the layout of the colony. Maybe we can assist with patrols or reconnaissance." Mitchell studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "But listen carefully. You follow orders, no exceptions. Out there, hesitation gets people killed, understand?" "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, his heart pounding. Beside him, Laura echoed the response, her voice steady and resolute. With that, they were given basic training on using the soldiers' weapons and equipment. The devices were far more advanced than anything the colonists had ever handled, but the soldiers patiently guided them through the basics. By the time they finished, dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. As Daniel and Laura prepared to join the soldiers outside, they exchanged a glance, silently reaffirming their commitment to each other and to their home. The road ahead would be difficult, possibly deadly, but they faced it together. Whatever happened next, they would stand side by side, ready to fight for the future of Epsilon 7. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted on Epsilon 7. The once pristine colony now resembled a war zone, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its streets littered with debris. Smoke rose from smoldering ruins, mixing with the crisp air to create an acrid haze that stung the eyes and throat. Despite the devastation, there was a sense of purpose in the air as soldiers and colonists worked together to prepare for the next wave of attacks. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the Zorathians returned, and when they did, the fight would be even harder. Daniel and Laura stood near the entrance of the command center, watching as teams of soldiers fortified the colony's defenses. Sandbags were stacked along key positions, creating makeshift barriers to shield against enemy fire. Turrets salvaged from damaged vehicles were mounted on rooftops, their barrels gleaming ominously in the sunlight. Nearby, engineers worked tirelessly to repair communication systems and restore power to critical areas. The hum of machinery filled the air, punctuated by the occasional shout or burst of laughter as people bonded over shared tasks. Lieutenant Samantha Brooks emerged from the command center, her helmet tucked under one arm. She scanned the scene, with sharp eyes, ensuring everything was proceeding according to plan. When she spotted Daniel and Laura, she motioned for them to join her. "You two ready?" she asked, her tone brisk but not unkind. "As ready as we'll ever be," Daniel replied, his voice tinged with nervousness. He adjusted the strap of the plasma rifle slung across his shoulder, still uneasy about carrying such a powerful weapon. Beside him, Laura nodded confidently, though her knuckles were white from gripping her own firearm too tightly. "Good," Brooks said. "We're deploying small scout teams to patrol the perimeter and gather intel on the enemy's movements. You'll be paired with experienced soldiers. They'll keep you safe while you show them the lay of the land." Before Daniel could respond, Jake Harper appeared beside them, grinning broadly. "Looks like I'm stuck babysitting again," he joked, earning a playful glare from Brooks. "Relax, Lieutenant. I've got this." Brooks rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. "Just don't get cocky out there," she warned. "These bugs are smarter than they look." With that, the group set off, moving cautiously through the ruined streets. The silence was eerie, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the distant caw of scavenger birds circling overhead. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every sound potentially dangerous. Daniel found himself constantly scanning his surroundings, his finger hovering near the trigger of his rifle. Laura walked close behind him, her expression calm but alert. Jake led the way, his movements fluid and confident. "So, where should we start?" he asked, glancing back at Daniel and Laura. "Any spots around here the bugs might use as hiding places?" Daniel thought for a moment, then pointed toward a cluster of abandoned warehouses on the edge of the colony. "Over there," he said. "Those buildings have underground tunnels connecting them. If the Zorathians are planning something, that's probably where they'd hole up." Jake nodded approvingly. "Good call. Let's check it out." As they approached the warehouses, the air grew colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Daniel's skin crawl. The doors hung crookedly on their hinges, battered from earlier fighting. Inside, the darkness was oppressive, swallowing the beam of Jake's flashlight as he swept it across the room. Shelves lay overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. Empty crates and discarded tools suggested the space had been used for storage, but now it felt like a tomb. "Stay sharp," Jake murmured, his voice low. "If anything moves, shoot first and ask questions later." Laura nodded, raising her rifle slightly. Daniel followed suit, his heart pounding in his chest. The trio moved slowly, their footsteps muffled by layers of dust. Every corner they turned revealed nothing but more emptiness, yet the tension continued to build. It was as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a faint skittering noise echoed through the warehouse. Daniel froze, his pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake held up a hand, signaling for silence. The skittering grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against metal. From the shadows emerged a lone Zorathian, its insectoid body glistening with moisture. Its glowing eyes locked onto the group, and it let out a high-pitched screech before lunging forward. "Take it down!" Jake shouted, firing his weapon in a single smooth motion. The bolt of energy struck the creature squarely in the chest, sending it sprawling backward. But before anyone could celebrate, several more Zorathians appeared, pouring out of hidden alcoves and crevices like a flood. "Fall back," Jake ordered, grabbing Daniel's arm and pulling him toward the exit. Laura fired blindly into the swarm, her shots hitting their marks but doing little to slow the advancing horde. The trio sprinted through the warehouse, dodging debris and narrowly avoiding swipes from razor-sharp claws. Once outside, Jake activated a beacon attached to his belt, signaling for backup. Within moments, reinforcements arrived, unleashing a barrage of firepower that forced the Zorathians to retreat. The creatures disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Breathing heavily, Daniel leaned against a nearby wall, his hands trembling as he lowered his rifle. "That was intense," he managed to say, his voice shaky. "You handled yourself well," Jake said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not bad for your first real firefight." Laura nodded in agreement, though her face was pale. "We need to warn the others," she said. "If those tunnels connect to other parts of the colony, the Zorathians could launch surprise attacks anywhere." Jake relayed the information to Lieutenant Brooks via his comms device, explaining the situation in detail. Moments later, orders came crackling through the line. All teams were to focus on securing the tunnels and cutting off potential entry points. The soldiers sprang into action, coordinating with the colonists to seal off access routes and set traps for any remaining enemies. Back at the command center, Captain Mitchell listened intently as reports poured in from various patrols. His expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. The Zorathians were proving to be far more resourceful than anticipated, adapting quickly to the humans' strategies. This wasn't just a random attack, it was a calculated invasion, driven by a purpose they had yet to uncover. "We need to find their leader," Mitchell said finally, addressing Brooks and Mr. Peterson. "Every hive has a queen, a central figure controlling the swarm. Take her out and the rest will fall apart." "But how do we find her?" Mr. Peterson asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "They're everywhere. We can't search every tunnel, every building." Brooks stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "We don't need to search everywhere," she said. "We follow the patterns. The Zorathians are harvesting resources, energy cells, raw materials, anything they can carry back to their base. If we track their supply lines, we'll find their nest." Mitchell nodded, impressed by her reasoning. "Do it," he said. "Gather your best people and start mapping out their movements. Time is running out." As the soldiers dispersed to carry out the new plan, Daniel and Laura exchanged a glance. They had survived their first mission, but the battle was far from over. The Zorathians were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, there was a spark of determination burning within them, a refusal to give up, no matter what. For the first time since the invasion began, Daniel allowed himself to believe that victory might actually be possible. Not because they were stronger or better equipped, but because they had something the Zorathians lacked: unity. Together, the colonists and soldiers formed a bond that transcended fear and uncertainty. And as long as they stood side by side, they had a chance not just to survive, but to reclaim their home. The plan to track the Zorathian supply lines was risky, but it was their best shot at finding the heart of the invasion. Lieutenant Samantha Brooks wasted no time assembling a team for the mission. Alongside her were Jake Harper, Daniel Carter, Laura Carter, and 2 other soldiers, Sergeant Emily Dawson and Private Marcus Hale. Each member brought something unique to the group: Brooks' tactical brilliance, Jake's quick thinking, Daniel and Laura's knowledge of the colony, Dawson's steady hand and Hale's sharp eyesight. Together they formed a balanced unit, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Before setting out, Brooks gathered the team in a corner of the command center, spreading out maps and sketches on a makeshift table. "Here's what we know," she began, pointing to key locations marked with red X's. "The Zorathians are using these tunnels to move supplies from the colony back to wherever their main base is. Our job is to follow the trail without being noticed. If they spot us, the entire operation falls apart." Jake leaned forward, studying the map intently. What about traps? Those bugs aren't stupid. They'll have guards posted along the roads. Brooks nodded. Exactly. That's why we need to stay quiet and move fast. We'll split into pairs if needed, but under no circumstances do we lose contact with each other. Communication is our lifeline. Daniel listened carefully, trying to absorb every detail. This wasn't like patrolling the perimeter or defending fixed positions. This was infiltration, requiring stealth and precision. He glanced at Laura, who met his gaze with a look of determination. She gave him a small nod, silently reassuring him that they could handle it. Once everyone understood the plan, the team geared up and headed out. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the colony. Nighttime worked in their favor. The darkness would help conceal their movements as they slipped through the ruins toward the first tunnel entrance. Brooks led the way, her helmet's visor glowing faintly as she scanned for threats. Behind her, Jake and Daniel carried portable scanners designed to detect energy signatures left behind by the Zorathians' stolen resources. The air inside the tunnel was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of decay. The walls were lined with exposed wiring and pipes, remnants of the colony's infrastructure now repurposed by the invaders. Every step echoed loudly, forcing the team to tread lightly to avoid drawing attention. Laura stayed close to Daniel, her weapon raised and ready. Despite her calm exterior, he could tell she was tense. Her jaw clenched tightly as she scanned the shadows. After several minutes of cautious progress, the scanners picked up a faint energy signal ahead. Brooks signaled for the team to halt, holding up 3 fingers before lowering them one by one. On 0, they moved forward in unison, weapons trained on the source of the signal. What they found was a small convoy of Zorathian drones dragging crates filled with power cells and scrap metal. The creatures scuttled along awkwardly, their oversized claws gripping the cargo tightly. "Stay low," Brooks whispered, motioning for the team to take cover behind a stack of crates. "We can disable them quietly." Jake nodded, pulling a small device from his belt. It looked like a handheld grenade, but instead of explosives, it emitted an electromagnetic pulse capable of disabling machinery. He crept closer to the drones, careful not to make a sound. When he was within range, he activated the device, sending a burst of energy rippling through the area. The drones froze mid-step, their glowing eyes dimming as they collapsed onto the ground. The team moved quickly, securing the supplies and planting tracking beacons on the crates. These devices would allow them to follow the path the Zorathians intended to take, leading them closer to the enemy's base. As they worked, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting a swarm of Zorathians to descend upon them at any moment. But the tunnels remained eerily silent, save for the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. Once the trackers were in place, Brooks ordered the team to fall back and regroup outside. They emerged from the tunnel just as the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Exhausted but triumphant, they reported their findings to Captain Mitchell, who immediately began analyzing the data. "This confirms it," Mitchell said, studying the tracker signals on a holographic display. "They're funneling everything to a central location, a large structure about 5 clicks east of here. If we hit them hard enough there, we might be able to cripple their operation." But before they could celebrate, another challenge presented itself. The Zorathians weren't idle during the night. Reports came in from patrols indicating increased activity near the colony's outskirts. Scouts spotted massive reinforcements moving in waves, likely preparing for a full-scale assault. The timing couldn't have been worse. With most of their forces focused on tracking the supply lines, the colony's defenses were stretched thin. "We need to act fast," Brooks said, addressing the team. "If we wait too long, the colony won't hold. We'll divide into 2 groups, one to strike at the nest and another to reinforce the defenses here. Who's with me?" Without hesitation, Jake raised his hand. "You know I'm in." Laura stepped forward next, followed closely by Daniel. "We're coming too," she said firmly. "This is our home. We're not letting them take it." Dawson and Hale exchanged a glance before nodding in agreement. Their loyalty to the mission, and to each other, was unwavering. Mitchell approved. The plan, assigning Sergeant Dawson to lead the defensive squad while Brooks took charge of the strike team heading for the nest. As the teams prepared to split up, Daniel pulled Jake aside. "Hey, thanks for looking out for us," he said awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "I don't think we'd have made it this far without you." Jake grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Don't mention it, kid. You're doing great. Just keep your head down and trust your instincts. You'll be fine." With that, the teams parted ways, each carrying the weight of the mission on their shoulders. Brooks' group moved swiftly across the barren landscape, sticking to cover as they approached the coordinates of the Zorathian nest. The structure loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette resembling a monstrous insect cocoon. Strange lights pulsed rhythmically along its surface, casting an ominous glow over the surrounding area. "This is it," Brooks said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Remember, once we go in, there's no turning back. Stick to the plan, and we'll get this done." The team exchanged determined nods, their resolve hardened by the stakes of the battle ahead. Inside the nest, the air vibrated with a low hum, like the collective buzzing of thousands of wings. Shadows flitted across the walls, revealing glimpses of Zorathian workers tending to machinery and hauling supplies deeper into the hive. Somewhere, within, the queen awaited, an alien monstrosity controlling the entire swarm. As they formulated their entry strategy, the sounds of distant explosions reached their ears. The attack on the colony had begun. Time was running out, and failure was not an option. With a final glance at each other, the strike team readied their weapons and prepared to breach the nest, knowing that the fate of Epsilon 7 rested in their hands.